close your eyes and let me take you back to a different time. A time when the American West was still wild, still untamed. A time when the line between lawman and outlaw was sometimes razor thin, and a man's choices could echo through history. This is the story of the Dalton Brothers, 4 young men who began their careers wearing badges, upholding the law in one of the most dangerous territories in America. But fate, ambition, and perhaps destiny itself would transform them into some of the most notorious outlaws the West had ever seen. Their story is one of family bonds that couldn't be broken, even by death itself, of impossible dreams and fatal pride, of a single day in a small Kansas town that would end in blood and legend. So settle in, relax, and let me tell you the true story of the Dalton brothers. Our story begins not with gunfire or robbery, but with a family trying to survive on the American frontier. Lewis Dalton and Adeline Younger were married in 1851, and together they would have 15 children, 15 mouths to feed in a time when life was hard and money was scarce. The Dalton family moved frequently, always chasing the promise of a better life, never quite finding it. From Kansas to Missouri, from Indian Territory to California and back again, the Daltons were restless, always searching. But Adeline Dalton brought something else to the family besides her strength and determination. She brought a name that carried weight in the West. Adeline was born a Younger, which meant that her children, the Dalton children, were cousins to some of the most famous outlaws in American history. You see, Adeline's nephews were the Younger brothers Cole, Jim, John, and Bob Younger. These men had ridden with Jesse and Frank James during their legendary crime spree following the Civil War. They had robbed banks and trains, fought gun battles with lawmen, and become the subjects of countless dime novels that portrayed them as romantic rebels fighting against an unjust system. For the Dalton children growing up in poverty, hearing stories about their famous cousins must have been intoxicating. Here were men who had taken what they wanted, who had refused to bow down to authority, who had become legends. The Younger brothers were in prison by the time the Dalton boys were coming of age, but their legend lived on. Of the 15 Dalton children, it would be 4 brothers who would write their names in history. 4 brothers who would follow, in many ways, the path their cousins had blazed. There was Grattan, called Grat by everyone who knew him. He was born in 1861, a big man, strong and somewhat slow-thinking, but loyal to his core. Then came William, called Bill, born in 1863. Bill was the most educated of the brothers, intelligent and politically ambitious. He seemed destined for a different life than his siblings. Robert, known as Bob, came along in 1869. Bob was the one who shone brightest, handsome, charismatic, intelligent, and ambitious. Bob was a natural leader, the kind of man people followed without question. And finally, there was Emmett, the baby of the group, born in 1871. Emmett idolized his older brothers, especially Bob. He would follow them anywhere, do anything they asked. But there was another brother, one we must talk about, though his story ends before our main tale truly begins. Frank Dalton was the eldest of the brothers who pursued law enforcement. Frank was everything you'd want in a lawman: honest, brave, dedicated to justice. He became a deputy U.S. Marshal working in the Indian Territory, the wild and dangerous land that would later become Oklahoma. The Indian Territory in the 1882nd was a lawless place. It was where outlaws fled when they'd worn out their welcome elsewhere. Jurisdiction was complicated, with tribal law, federal law, and territorial law all overlapping and sometimes contradicting each other. It was a place where a deputy marshal had to be tough, smart, and quick with a gun just to survive. Frank Dalton was all of these things. He earned respect from both lawmen and outlaws alike. The younger Dalton brothers looked up to Frank more than anyone else in the world. He was their hero, their role model, the example of what a man should be. On November 27th, 1887, Frank Dalton's story came to a violent end. He was attempting to arrest a group of outlaws when gunfire erupted. Frank was shot and killed. He died doing his duty, died wearing a badge, died as a hero. But Frank's death devastated his younger brothers. They had lost their guiding light, their moral compass. And in the grief and anger that followed, something began to change in Grat, Bob, and young Emmett. They would follow Frank's path and become lawmen themselves. But unlike Frank, they wouldn't stay on that path for long. After Frank's death, his brothers Grat, Bob, and Emmett all took positions in law enforcement. It seemed natural. They wanted to honor Frank's memory, to carry on his legacy. Bob and Grat became deputy U.S. marshals, while Emmett, still just a teenager, worked as a posseman, assisting the deputies on their dangerous missions. The work was brutal. The Indian Territory was vast, spanning thousands of square miles of rough country. A deputy might have to ride for days to track down a single criminal. The danger was constant. Outlaws had nothing to lose. They knew that capture meant the end of a rope, so they fought like cornered animals. And the pay? The pay was insulting. A deputy marshal received $2 for each arrest. Just $2, plus 6 cents per mile traveled. When you factored in the cost of supplies, ammunition, and horses, a deputy could barely break even, much less support a family. Bob Dalton was particularly good at his job. He was fearless in a fight, smart in his tracking, and had a natural authority that made even hardened criminals think twice about resisting. People said Bob could have risen high in law enforcement if he'd stuck with it. He had the talent, the intelligence, and the presence. But as Bob rode across the territory, arresting outlaws who had stolen hundreds or thousands of dollars, only to receive his paltry $2 fee, something began eating at him. Frank had died for this. Frank had given everything, had sacrificed his life. And for what? The family hadn't even received a decent pension. Frank's widow struggled to make ends meet. Meanwhile, the outlaws Bob arrested lived like kings between their robberies. They wore fine clothes, stayed in nice hotels, and when they were caught, they could often afford lawyers who got them light sentences or outright acquittals. The injustice of it gnawed at Bob. And Bob talked to his brothers. Grat listened. Emmett, who worshipped Bob, listened even more intently. The exact moment the Dalton brothers crossed the line from lawmen to outlaws is lost to history. But by 1890, accusations began to swirl around them. Horse theft was the charge, a serious crime in the West, where a man's horse could mean the difference between life and death. Were the accusations true? Some historians believe the Daltons were actually guilty, that they had begun supplementing their meager law enforcement income with a little horse theft on the side. Others argue that the charges were politically motivated, that enemies in the territorial government wanted the Daltons gone and trumped up charges to achieve that goal. The truth doesn't really matter, because Bob Dalton made a decision. Rather than stand trial, rather than try to clear his name through legal channels, he chose to run. And Grat and Emmett ran with him. In that moment, everything changed. They were no longer lawmen, they were fugitives. And Bob Dalton decided that if society was going to treat them as outlaws, then outlaws they would be. But not small-time horse thieves. Bob had bigger ambitions than that. He had grown up hearing stories about Jesse James, about the younger brothers, about outlaws who had become legends. Bob wanted that kind of fame. He wanted people to speak his name with awe. He wanted to be remembered. Bob began to plan. He would form a gang. They would rob trains and banks. They would be bold, daring, and successful. They would surpass the James gang, surpass even his famous cousins, the Youngers. Bob Dalton would become the greatest outlaw the West had ever seen, or he would die trying. Bob Dalton was methodical in forming his gang. He knew he needed men he could trust, men who could handle themselves in a fight, men who wouldn't panic when bullets started flying. His brothers Grat and Emmett were the core. Bob knew he could count on them absolutely. Family came first, always. They would ride together, fight together, and if it came to it, die together. To this inner circle, Bob added several associates. There was Bill Power, also known as Tom Evans, a cowboy who drifted into outlaw life. Dick Broadwell, another cowhand turned criminal. Charlie Pierce and George Newcomb, who went by the wonderful nickname Bitter Creek. These men formed the nucleus of what would become known as the Dalton Gang. The gang's first robbery took place on February 6th, 1891, in Alila, California. Bob had planned to rob the Southern Pacific train there, making off with whatever gold or cash the express car was carrying. But the Alila robbery was a disaster from start to finish. The train crew resisted. Shots were fired. The fireman, a man named George Radliff, was killed. The gang barely escaped with any money at all. Worse, they were identified almost immediately. Their anonymity, so crucial for outlaws, was gone before they'd hardly begun. Bob quickly realized his mistake. Robbing in California, where they had no connections and no safe hideouts, was foolish. They needed to operate in territory they knew, where they had friends and family who would shelter them. They needed to go home, to the Indian Territory. So the gang returned to Oklahoma. And there, Bob's planning improved. On May 9th, 1891, they robbed a Santa Fe train at Wharton in the Indian Territory. This time, they got $1,400. More importantly, they got away clean. The taste of success was addictive. The money was more than Bob could have made in years as a deputy marshal. The thrill of outsmarting the law, of taking what he wanted, fed something deep inside him. Bob planned another robbery, and then another. Red Rock Station, Leliata, Pryor Creek, Adair. The Dalton gang struck again and again throughout 1891 and 1892. They developed a system, a routine that worked. They would scout the target carefully, studying the train schedules, the station layouts, the placement of guards. They would strike quickly, usually at night. They would take the money and vanish into the territory's vast wilderness, where sympathetic farmers and ranchers would hide them. The press began to take notice. Newspapers ran stories about the daring Dalton gang. Wanted posters appeared in every town and train station from Texas to Kansas. The rewards on their heads grew larger with each robbery, and Bob loved it. He loved seeing his name in the papers. He loved knowing that people feared him. He was becoming famous, becoming a legend. He was following in his cousin's footsteps, and he was determined to go even further. But fame brought danger. Lawmen across 3 territories now hunted the Daltons. Pinkertons, railroad detectives, deputy marshals, and local sheriffs all wanted the glory of bringing down the gang. Every robbery increased the heat, brought the hunters closer. The robbery at Adair, Oklahoma, on July 14th, 1892, showed how dangerous their life had become. As the Missouri, Kansas, Texas train pulled into the station, the gang appeared with guns drawn. But this time, people fought back. Guards fired from the train. Townspeople grabbed weapons. In the resulting gunfight, several people were wounded. The gang got their money, $1,700, but they left wounded men behind, including local doctors who had tried to stop them. The violence was escalating. Bob could feel the net closing in. They needed one more robbery, one big score that would set them up for life. Then they could retire, head to Mexico or South America, live like kings. Bob had an idea, an impossible idea, an idea so audacious that no outlaw gang had ever attempted it. Bob Dalton was going to rob 2 banks at the same time, in the same town, in broad daylight. His brothers thought he was crazy. Even Dick Broadwell and Bill Power had doubts. But Bob was the leader, and when Bob spoke, they listened. He had a plan, he assured them. He'd studied the James gang's robberies, the Youngers' mistakes. He knew what had gone wrong for them, and he wouldn't repeat those errors. The target Bob chose was Coffeyville, Kansas, a town of about 4,000 people. A peaceful prairie town with 2 banks practically across the street from each other. The First National Bank and the Condon Bank. There was just one problem, one detail that might have given anyone else pause. Coffeyville was the town where the Dalton family had lived during Bob's childhood. It was his hometown. People there would recognize him. But Bob wasn't worried. They would wear disguises, fake beards and mustaches. They would be in and out in 5 minutes. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the Dalton gang would be miles away, splitting up the biggest haul in outlaw history. Bob's ambition had become obsession. He didn't just want to be successful. He wanted to be the greatest. He wanted to do what even Jesse James and his cousins, the Youngers, had never done. He wanted immortality. And in Coffeyville, Kansas, Bob Dalton would get his wish. Just not the way he imagined. October 5th, year 1892. Let me paint you a picture of this day, this place, this moment in time. It's early autumn in Kansas. The air is crisp and cool, the sky a perfect blue. Coffeyville is bustling with morning activity. Shops are opening, people are going about their business. Children head to school. It's an ordinary Wednesday morning in an ordinary American town. 5 riders approach from the southwest. They ride good horses, and they're dressed like working cowboys. Nothing unusual about that. Cowboys drift through all the time. But if you looked closely, you might notice something odd about them. They're wearing false beards, clearly fake if you examine them carefully. And there's something tense about the way they sit their horses, something watchful. The riders are Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Emmett Dalton, Bill Power, and Dick Broadwell. They're about to attempt the greatest bank robbery in the history of the American West. They ride into town around 9:30 in the morning and hitch their horses in an alley behind the town plaza, across from where the 2 banks sit. Bob has studied the layout carefully. After the robbery, they'll run back to this alley, mount their horses, and be gone before resistance can organize. The 5 men walk toward the plaza. Bob, Emmett, and Dick Broadwell head for the First National Bank. Grat and Bill Power walk toward the Condon Bank. The timing has to be perfect. They need to hit both banks simultaneously, grab the money, and get out. At 9:43 in the morning, the Dalton gang enters both banks. Inside the First National Bank, Bob's group draws their guns. Bob commands everyone to put their hands up. He's calm, professional. This isn't his first robbery. The bank employees comply. Bob and his brothers begin gathering money from the teller drawers and the vault. Everything is going according to plan. They're gathering around $20,000 a fortune by 1892 standards. Across the street at the Condon Bank, Grat and Bill Power encounter a problem. They demand the vault be opened, but the cashier, a man named Charles Ball, tells them it's on a time lock. It won't open for another 10 minutes. It's a lie. The vault isn't on a time lock at all. But Grat, who isn't as quick-thinking as Bob, believes him. 10 minutes. They can wait 10 minutes. What's 10 minutes? 10 minutes is an eternity. Outside, people are starting to notice something is wrong. Someone peers through the window of the First National Bank and sees men with guns. Someone else recognizes Emmett Dalton despite his fake beard. Emmett grew up here, and some features are hard to disguise. Whispers spread through the plaza. That's Emmett Dalton. The Daltons are here. They're robbing the banks. The whispers become shouts. Someone yells, "The banks are being robbed. It's the Dalton gang." Now, what happens next tells you something important about the people of Coffeyville. They don't panic. They don't run away and hide. Instead, they arm themselves. Store owners grab rifles from their shops. The town marshal, Charles Connolly, draws his pistol and starts organizing the defense. Citizens who've never fired a shot in anger suddenly become soldiers defending their town. Hardware stores distribute weapons to anyone who wants one. Men take up positions around the plaza, behind water troughs, in doorways, on rooftops, inside the banks. The Daltons don't know yet that their 5-minute robbery has become a trap. At the First National Bank, Bob's group finishes gathering the money. They've got about $20,000 in bags. Bob is pleased. Everything has gone smoothly here. He signals to Emmett and Dick Broadwell. Time to go. They head for the door. And the moment they step outside into the October sunshine, bullets start flying. The sound of gunfire erupts across the plaza. It comes from every direction, from the hardware store, from the drugstore, from second-story windows. The citizens of Coffeyville have turned their peaceful town into a war zone. Bob, Emmett, and Dick Broadwell fire back, running for the alley where their horses wait. Bullets kick up dirt around their feet. Glass shatters. Wood splinters. Across the street, Grat and Bill Power hear the shooting. The 10 minutes aren't up, but they can't wait any longer. They grab what money they can, about $3,000, and burst out of the Condon Bank. They too are met with a hail of bullets. The Battle of Coffeyville has begun, and it will last just 12 minutes. 12 minutes that will leave 8 men dead and change the course of Western history. Charles Connolly, the brave town marshal, steps into the street to confront the robbers. He fires at Grat Dalton, but Bill Power shoots Connolly, and the marshal falls, mortally wounded. He will die a short time later. George Cubine, a local bootmaker, grabs a rifle and takes position near a fence. He's trying to get a clear shot at the outlaws, but Grat sees him and fires first. Cubine falls dead. Charles Brown, who runs a local store, steps out to see what's happening. A stray bullet catches him in the head. He dies instantly. The outlaws are suffering too. Bill Power, running for the alley, is hit multiple times. He falls in the alley, dying. He never makes it to his horse. Dick Broadwell manages to reach his horse and mount up. He spurs the animal and gallops out of town. But he's been hit badly. He makes it about a mile outside Coffeyville before he falls from his saddle, dead. Bob and Emmett are still fighting, still trying to reach their horses. Bob is in his element. This is what he was made for. The action, the danger, the fight. He fires and moves, fires and moves. But there are too many guns, too many bullets. The citizens of Coffeyville aren't professional gunfighters, but they don't need to be. There are dozens of them, and they're shooting from cover. Grat Dalton is hit. He staggers, but keeps moving, keeps firing. He's hit again, and again. He falls in the alley, bleeding from multiple wounds. Bob reaches the alley. He can see the horses. They're right there. Grat is down but still alive. Bob turns to help his brother. And then Bob Dalton, the young man who wanted to be the greatest outlaw who ever lived, is struck by a bullet. It enters his chest, piercing his heart. Bob falls beside Grat. The two brothers lie in the dirt of the alley, dying together. Emmett Dalton sees his brothers fall. And here, in this moment, Emmett faces the most important choice of his life. His horse is right there. He could mount up and ride away. He might make it. He's young. His horse is fresh, and the attention is on his fallen brothers. But Emmett can't leave them. They're his brothers. Bob is his hero, the man he's followed his entire life. How can he ride away and leave Bob dying in the dirt? Emmett turns back. He rides his horse up to where Bob and Grat lie. He reaches down, trying to pull Bob up onto the horse, and the guns roar again. Emmett is shot. Once, twice, 3 times. The bullets keep coming. Witnesses will later count more than 20 wounds on Emmett's body. He falls from his horse, landing near his brothers. The shooting stops. The 12 minutes are over. The plaza is filled with gun smoke and the cries of wounded men. 4 citizens of Coffeyville are dead or dying. 4 members of the Dalton gang are dead. And one, Emmett Dalton, lies in a spreading pool of blood, somehow still alive. Bob's last words, whispered as he dies, are a question. Emmett? He's asking about his youngest brother, even in death. Grat dies moments later, never speaking, just staring at the sky. The greatest bank robbery in the history of the West has ended in complete catastrophe. The Daltons wanted immortality, wanted their names remembered forever. They got their wish. In the hours after the shooting, Coffeyville had to deal with the carnage. 8 men were dead, several more wounded. The streets were blood-stained. Shattered glass and splintered wood marked where bullets had struck. The bodies of the gang members were dragged to the town square and laid out for viewing. This was common practice in that era, displaying the bodies of dead outlaws as both a warning and a curiosity. Photographers arrived to capture the scene. Those photographs would be turned into postcards and sold across the country. In death, the Daltons had become a commodity. Crowds gathered to view the bodies. People traveled from surrounding towns to see the famous outlaws. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Others came to spit on the corpses, to express their contempt for men who had terrorized trains and banks across the territory. Bob Dalton lay there, his handsome features frozen in death. He'd been so close to his goal, so close to his horses, and escape. Grat lay beside him, the big man finally at rest. Bill Power and Dick Broadwell were brought back to town and added to the display. And then there was Emmett. Emmett Dalton should have been dead. By all logic, by all medical understanding, a man shot more than 20 times should not survive. But somehow, impossibly, Emmett clung to life. The townspeople, satisfied with their vengeance against the others, had no desire to kill a helpless wounded man. They called for a doctor. Emmett was carried to a hotel room and laid on a bed. The doctor examined him and counted wound after wound. Bullets had torn through Emmett's arms, his legs, his torso. He'd lost an enormous amount of blood. The doctor did what he could, but he didn't expect Emmett to survive the night. But Emmett did survive that night. And the next, day by day, against all odds, Emmett Dalton fought his way back to life. When Emmett was finally strong enough to stand trial, he pleaded guilty to murder charges for the death of George Cuban. The judge sentenced him to life in prison at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. The people of Coffeyville buried their dead with honor. Charles Connolly, George Cubine, Charles Brown, and Lucius Baldwin were laid to rest as heroes. They had defended their town against overwhelming odds. They had stood up to armed and dangerous outlaws when it would have been safer to hide. Every year after that, Coffeyville would remember October 5th, 1892. They would remember the day the Dalton gang came to town and the day ordinary citizens became heroes. As for the Daltons, Bob and Grat were buried in the Elmwood Cemetery in Coffeyville, though their family later had the bodies moved to Kingfisher, Oklahoma, to rest in the family plot. Their dreams of wealth and fame had led them to unmarked graves and blood-stained streets. The story should have ended there. But the Dalton saga had one more chapter to be written. Bill Dalton, the fourth brother, the one who had stayed out of the gang's criminal activities, heard the news from Coffeyville. His brothers were dead. Emmett was crippled and imprisoned for life. And Bill, the educated, ambitious politician, lost his mind with grief and rage. Bill blamed society. He blamed the law. He blamed everyone for the deaths of his brothers. And in his fury, Bill decided to follow the path his brothers had taken. If the world wanted to make the Daltons into outlaws, then he would show them what an outlaw could be. Bill formed his own gang, partnering with another outlaw named Bill Doolin. The Doolin-Dalton gang, as they became known, began robbing banks and trains across Oklahoma Territory. For 2 years, Bill Dalton lived the outlaw life his brothers had embraced. But on June 8th, 1894, Bill's story came to its inevitable end. Lawmen tracked him to a ranch near Ardmore, Oklahoma. They called for him to surrender. Bill ran for his horse, and the officers opened fire. Bill Dalton fell dead, shot in the back as he tried to escape. With Bill's death, the Dalton Brothers saga truly ended. 4 brothers dead, 1 imprisoned, a family legacy written in blood and gunpowder. But let's return to Emmett, because his story takes an unexpected turn. Emmett Dalton entered Kansas State Penitentiary in 1893, a broken man. He was just 21 years old, sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his days. His body bore the scars of more than 20 bullet wounds, and his soul bore the weight of watching his brothers die. Prison in the 1,890 seconds was a brutal experience. Emmett worked in the prison quarry, breaking rocks under the hot Kansas sun. He had time, an endless expanse of time to think about his choices, his life, his dead brothers. But something happened to Emmett during those years. He changed. He educated himself, reading everything he could get his hands on. He thought deeply about the path that had led him to prison, and he began to understand that Bob's dream of glory had been hollow, that the outlaw life had given them nothing but death and destruction. Emmett became a model prisoner. He caused no trouble, helped other inmates, worked hard. The prison officials took notice. So did people outside the prison walls. In 1907, after serving 14 years, Emmett Dalton received something none of his brothers had lived to see: a second chance. The governor of Kansas granted him a pardon. Emmett walked out of prison, a free man, at the age of 36. Now, what would you do with a second chance like that? Emmett could have disappeared, lived quietly somewhere under an assumed name. But Emmett did something remarkable. He decided to use his infamy for good. Emmett married his longtime sweetheart, Julia Johnson, who had waited for him throughout his imprisonment. They moved to California, and there Emmett began a new career. He became a building contractor, working honest jobs with his hands. But he also began writing. Emmett wrote books about his outlaw days. But these weren't romantic tales glorifying the criminal life. Instead, Emmett wrote cautionary tales. He described the reality of the outlaw trail, the fear, the violence, the inevitable doom. He wrote about watching his brothers die in a dirty alley for money they never got to spend. He wrote about the wasted years in prison, the pain, the regret. Then Hollywood came calling. In the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds, Western films were hugely popular, and filmmakers wanted authentic stories. Emmett became a consultant for Western movies. He even acted in a few films, playing himself or characters based on his experiences. But more than that, Emmett became a speaker. He traveled to schools and spoke to young people. His message was simple and powerful. Crime doesn't pay. The outlaw life is not romantic or glamorous. It ends in death or prison. Learn from his mistakes. Don't throw your life away chasing impossible dreams like he and his brothers had. Imagine the power of that message, delivered by a man who had lived it. Here was Emmett Dalton, survivor of the Coffeyville raid, standing before young people with his scarred body and weathered face, telling them the truth about the West that the dime novels never mentioned. Emmett lived until 1937, dying at the age of 66 of natural causes. He'd outlived all his brothers by more than 4 decades. He'd found love, found honest work, found purpose. In the end, Emmett Dalton achieved something his brothers never could: redemption. Before he died, Emmett said something that sums up the entire story of the Dalton brothers. He said, "The biggest fool on earth is the one who thinks he can beat the law." Bob had thought he could beat the law. Grat and Bill had followed him into that belief, and they had all paid the ultimate price. Only Emmett, the youngest, the one who had followed Bob most devotedly, survived to learn the truth. And he spent the last 30 years of his life trying to save others from making the same mistakes. The sun rises and sets over Coffeyville, Kansas, just as it did on October 5th, 1892. The town has changed, of course. Cars replaced horses. Pavement covered the dirt streets where men once fell. The banks that the Daltons tried to rob are gone, replaced by newer buildings. But on the plaza, there's a mural depicting the raid. There are markers showing where each man fell. The history is preserved, remembered, taught to new generations. And across America, the name Dalton still means something. It represents the wildness of the Old West, the thin line between law and outlaw, the dreams of glory that lead young men astray. If Bob Dalton could see how his story ended, would he make different choices? Would he realize that the 5 minutes he spent robbing banks in Coffeyville cost him everything: his life, his brothers' lives, any chance at the real legacy he desired? We can only imagine, but we have Emmett's testimony, and Emmett said that if he could go back, he would have stayed a lawman. He would have honored Frank's memory by living a good life, not by dying in a dusty alley chasing an impossible dream. The American West was many things: beautiful and terrible, free and dangerous, promising and unforgiving. The Dalton brothers experienced all of it. They wore badges and they wore disguises. They upheld the law and they broke it. They were heroes' brothers and they became villains themselves. Their story reminds us that our choices define us more than our circumstances. Bob, Grat, and Bill chose the outlaw path, and it led them to early graves. Emmett chose that path too, but then chose differently when given a second chance. He chose redemption, chose to warn others, chose to make something good from the tragedy. The West that the Daltons knew is gone now. The wild territories have become states. The train robberies have ended. The gunfights in dusty streets are just memories and museum exhibits. But human nature remains the same. We still face choices between right and wrong, between the easy path and the honest one, between chasing glory and building something real. The Dalton brothers thought they were choosing freedom when they became outlaws, but they were actually choosing a cage, a life of constant running, constant fear, constant looking over their shoulders. True freedom, as Emmett finally learned, comes not from taking what you want, but from earning what you have. So remember the Dalton brothers. Remember Bob's ambition that consumed him. Remember Grat's loyalty that led him to follow his brother into death. Remember Bill's rage that destroyed what was left of the family. And remember Emmett's redemption, proof that even from the darkest places, we can find our way back to the light. The story of the Dalton brothers is finished now, ended in the dust of Coffeeville more than a century ago. But its lessons remain, echoing across the years, reminding us that the choices we make today will echo into tomorrow. Rest now, and let the ghosts of the Old West fade back into history where they belong. The Dalton brothers have told their tale, and now their story is complete.